The game's plot is simple, with a villain named Xdeath threatening the world and Bart's and the party opposing him. It's notable for having the party leave the planet at one point to explore another planet, and then the two merging into a composite world, basically giving the player 3 worlds to explore. Like 4, the game was notable for its difficulty. Players were forced to master several different jobs for each character to stand a chance. Like 4, Squaresoft planned to localize and rebrand Final Fantasy V in America as Final Fantasy III. However, despite 3 separate attempts to bring the game to America, it just wasn't meant to happen. Firstly, the American Final Fantasy III was cancelled, as the localization team found the game to be too difficult and complex, not accessible enough for American gamers who had not yet embraced RPGs. After a time, another attempt at localization was made, this time under the title Final Fantasy Extreme. That would be marketed specifically as a hard game, though this also fell through as it still felt the game was too inaccessible. The third attempt was to bring the game to PC. However, this was cancelled to focus more on other prominent projects. American fans who were aware of the game became frustrated, and eventually the game was fully translated by fans for emulation, the first Final Fantasy game to receive this treatment. As much as the high difficulty and complex job system was popular, the next game, Final Fantasy VI, would prove to have even more in common with 4. Once again, there was a rotating cast of characters with defined roles, and once again, the game was more driven by storyline than by character growth. Final Fantasy VI was also the first to explore themes beyond that of a pseudo-medieval world. Elements of technology started to creep in. Eventually, Final Fantasy would be known for futuristic science fiction settings, and in a way, Final Fantasy VI is the industrial revolution that started it. Gameplay remains to be very much like 4, with the ATB system and a variety of characters. The plot of the game is at first a seemingly simplistic affair, with a group of rebels fighting against a powerful empire. However, the empire turns out to pale in comparison to the game's true villain, Kefka Palazzo, an insane jester who gains the powers of a god. Similar to 5, the game world changes. However, instead of traveling to different worlds, the world is instead modified by Kefka throughout the storyline. Final Fantasy VI was a huge hit, both commercially and critically, garnering almost universal praise and high sales. Buzz around the game continues to this day, where many gamers still consider it to be among the best of, if not the best of, the Final Fantasy titles. Common praise goes to the game's advanced graphics, storyline, soundtrack, and certain characters, most usually Kefka himself. He's usually cited as being one of the best RPG villains of all time. Final Fantasy VI's success helped lead to another successful localization to America, rebranded as Final Fantasy III, as it was the third game to be released in the series. However, it would be the last game to be rebranded in America. All future releases, including re-releases of the first 6 games, would retain the original numbering from the Japanese releases. Final Fantasy IV, V, and VI make up the 16-bit era of the Final Fantasy games, where the series started to hit its stride and become more popular not only in Japan, but in America as well. Unlike the NES games, of which only 1 was released in America, this time 2 out of 3 were released, and to moderate success. By the end of the 16-bit era, RPGs were becoming more popular in America, and although it would take the PlayStation to truly bring them into the mainstream, more and more games were being released here that normally would have stayed in Japan, such as Enix's Illusion of Gaia or Squaresoft's own Chrono Trigger. Like the first 3 games, 4, 5, and 6 have each been released numerous times. First, Final Fantasy IV saw a release in Japan as Final Fantasy IV Easy Type. This version of the game, still for the Super Famicom, toned down the difficulty greatly, and was mostly aimed at younger gamers. A common misconception is that the American release, Final Fantasy II, is a translated version of Easy Type, as the American release also had toned down difficulty. However, the Easy Type is much, much easier than the Americanized version, and was released later on. And, as I mentioned in the previous episode very briefly, Final Fantasy IV was also released on the WonderSwan Color, though unlike the releases of Final Fantasy I and II, the graphics were not greatly enhanced. All three games were then re-released for the PlayStation in Japan, with new features such as CGI cutscenes and some minor bug fixes. The three were also available as a single package, Final Fantasy Collection, also for PlayStation and also in Japan only. American gamers instead got two separate releases, Final Fantasy Anthology and Final Fantasy Chronicles. Anthology featured 5 and 6, while Chronicles featured 4, as well as Chrono Trigger, another enhanced port of a Super NES game. The three games were then re-released on the Game Boy Advance as part of the Finest Fantasy for Advance project, which retranslated and touched up the games, giving them new features such as status portraits during dialogue and rebalanced gameplay, and in some cases new areas, and in the case of 5, new jobs. The games were released as Final Fantasy IV Advance, Final Fantasy V Advance, and Final Fantasy VI Advance. Finally, Final Fantasy IV was re-released one last time for the Nintendo DS, with a 3D makeover similar to that of Final Fantasy III on the DS. Personally, I find it interesting that out of the first 6 games in the series, all of them except 3 were released on the Game Boy Advance, and the first 4 were released again for more advanced handhelds, with 1 and 2 winding up on the PSP, a 3D-oriented system, but in 2D, and 3 and 4 came out for the DS, a 2D-oriented system, but in 3D. Weird. Final Fantasy IV, 5, and 6 are all classics, and for many gamers, they were the first introductions to the series. Unfortunately, for those that followed the series on Nintendo systems, Squaresoft would next break away from Nintendo, releasing the next 4 games exclusively on Sony consoles. And although sequels, spin-offs, and remakes have been featured on Nintendo consoles, the main series has not yet reappeared on any of them. Join me next time and we'll talk about how and why this happened as we cover the next 3 games in the series.